Hi, and welcome to the 52nd episode of the Machine Ethics Podcast. This month we're talking to Damien Williams. We made this recording on the 3rd of February 2021. We chat about types of human and algorithmic discrimination, human technology expectations and norms, problems with government benefit services that use algorithms, the contextual nature of sample data, is facial recognition even a good idea at all, being honest about problems in your system, should we be scared about GDP3 taking all our jobs, encoding values into autonomous beings, and AI and dogma. You can find more episodes from us at machine-ethics.net. You can contact us at hello@machine-ethics.net, and you can follow us on Twitter at machine_ethics and Instagram Machine Ethics Podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/machine ethics. And thanks again for listening. Damien, thanks for joining me on the podcast. It's awesome to see you again and to have this conversation. So if you could quickly introduce yourself, who you are and what do you do?
My name is Damien Patrick Williams. I'm a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech. My research is in the area of values, bias, algorithms, AI, and generally how human values intersect with, influence, and are reflected in the technologies that we create.
Thank you very much. And there's a question that we always ask at the head of the podcast, which I'm pretty sure you actually might have previously answered on another podcast because we met at a AI retreat, which sounds a bit fancy now. And to be honest, it was fancy.
It was very fancy.
I'm missing it now. We were just chatting about it briefly. Yeah, so the brilliant Andy Budd put us and lots of other people together to talk about AI and ethics and stuff in a lovely hotel in Norway, and that was maybe it was 2.5 years ago, something like that.
Yeah,
a while ago.
Yeah. Wow.
So there is a podcast episode on that, which I will refer to at the end because I can't remember which one it is. What is AI, Damien? To you, like, what is this stuff that we talk about, AI?
To me, the question of what is AI is always really interesting because a lot of what I'm very interested in is exactly that weird untangling of what is AI, right? Like, because everybody I talk to uses it differently. So for me, AI is both the automated algorithmic applications that we use to kind of supplement and enhance and otherwise support the activities of human intelligence in everyday life, but it's also that kind of bigger, broader, large-scale dream and aim of AI, that kind of artificial general intelligence, or as I like to think of it, that kind of automated generative intelligence, that machine consciousness, that machine intelligence that is itself capable of independent, autonomous, generative, intelligent thought. And that is a dream that I think we still have not yet fully reached. It's a dream that I think is starting to kind of fade to the background in a lot of AI discussions, as that kind of first definition is more and more attainable and more people kind of go with it. And they're like, we can kind of make supplements, we can make patches that help other people do their day-to-day stuff, so let's just keep doing that. And that idea of, but what about a conscious machine has kind of faded to the background.
Yeah, awesome. And I believe while we last spoke, just so much passion coming out from you. Obviously, the setting was very different, and we had some really good conversations there, some of which I was able to capture, which is great. I'm really interested in talking to you about lots of things, and some of those things are about the cultural artifacts, right? You were talking about, how do we untangle these sort of things, what the values that we kind of put on these types of technologies, but also kind of what are the things that we want to get out of this. And AGI, is one of those dreams that we have, general intelligence. But also there's like this other stuff to do with a lot of the kind of uprising that happened last year around, Black and different minorities across the world, and how technologies can be discriminative and oppressive in some ways. So I was wondering if we could start like that with that one, and then we could bridge over to the cultural stuff. So,
Yes.
what are the forms of discrimination that AI can take?
So it's interesting because the forms of discrimination that AI can take are pretty much all the forms of discrimination that humans can do, plus some ones that we never really anticipate. And so what ends up happening in most algorithmic and AI applications is that ultimately we find ourselves in a place where the idea of what we think we're trying to do, the application that we're trying to figure out, kind of takes precedence, and we don't really think about what it is we're telling the program to do. And so if we have in those, the design phase and the coding phase and the programming and in the implementation, if we have certain biases that we are unaware of or that just go uninterrogated for any number of reasons, then they will make their way into the actual implementation of these programs. This is what the things that we found. So we can see gender discrimination in terms of gender discrimination based on names, based on the perception that of what types of words are associated with what types of genders. And then we have racial discrimination. We see that most often played out in facial recognition, automated camera technologies, any type of, even in just basic light readers. Like we have, photo measurement systems that are automated that don't read darker skin well, and that's been true for decades now. We also have, in terms of, certain applications, take those types of applications and kind of play them out further. When we have problems with, say, AI applications of facial recognition on the transgender community, or of body type readers, body scanners on the transgender and the disabled community. Body scanners, the big stand-up body scanners in the airport. If they happen to read something they read or they deem as non-standard or as anomalous, then they will flag that person for extra pat downs or extra scrutiny. And one of the ways that happens is if the human on the other side of the screen presses a button that says that the gender they perceive that person to be is something, and what the scanner reads is for any number of reasons anomalous, then that person will get flagged. Transgender individuals are harmed by this, but also not even just in terms of the gender aspect, but also in terms of just what a body is, quote unquote, supposed to look like aspect. If someone has, say, an ostomy bag, colostomy bag, or urinalysis bag that allows them to use the restroom because they've had surgery on their lower intestine or their kidneys, that is not a thing that a body scanner knows how to understand. And if the person who sees that shape, which is flagged as anomalous and rests right at about hip level, where a weapon might be, they're going to perhaps a bit more aggressively pat that person down, and they are going to perhaps cause the contents of that bag to expel themselves onto the person being patted down. And I say perhaps, what I mean is that's actually happened several times. So in all of these places, we have certain expectations about what a body should look like, what a person should be, how a person should behave, normative types of expectations of should and right kind, right? And all of these things have been encoded into the systems, both the actual technological systems, the artifacts themselves, but also into the technosystem relationship between humans and those systems, and how humans are expected to relate to those systems, how they're expected to use those systems, the expectations that the humans have in mind when they're using it, the expectations that the systems have encoded into them, then create that kind of feedback loop where they go, oh, well, this is what I'm supposed to expect here, and this is how I'm supposed to behave when that expectation is met, and so this is what I'm supposed to do in this situation, without ever really interrogating why might this be different? What might be happening here? What haven't we been told to expect? What might this mean about a human being's way of living in the world that I didn't get told to expect, that this machine wasn't programmed to expect? And so those are just a smattering of the ways that these things can kind of like go very, very wrong. The like long-term big picture stuff, one of the things that I've been really kind of invested in recently is disability rights benefits here in the US. Are often in many localities and states, they are administered by algorithm, and those algorithms are often black boxed. Their internal functions are hidden from the people whose lives their decisions are affecting. And many, like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union here in the U.S., has had to sue to on behalf of disabled patients, and to say we need to be able to see what's going on inside of this because it made a decision about my benefits that reduced my benefits drastically year on year for reasons that I fundamentally don't understand when my situation hasn't changed. So that's, these are life and death kind of things that happen every day. And all of these systems have been kind of proliferated widely from this kind of base uninterrogated state, right? And so all of those perceptions, all of those assumptions, all of those potential biases have made their way into all of those systems.
Mm-hmm. And it seems odd to me because obviously, you and I and lots of people who we have on this podcast, we think a lot about this sort of stuff, but it seems kind of antithetical that people would just put in an algorithm and go, okay, well, your benefit payments have changed and there's nothing you can do about it, right? So that sounds like a bad situation from the get-go, right?
Yeah.
So
it is.
Yeah. So I mean, I hope that people are waking up to kind of the stupidity of this fact, and obviously we can't always account for all the unintended consequences, but we better account for as many of the consequences and the impacts and harms that these systems produce, because that instance that you described is quite a high impact thing, right?
Exactly that.
And you're not going to impact the normal people, in the way that you're talking about the scanners as well, right? Like if you look normal to the scanner, or the distribution of whatever your body shape is correct, right? Then
if the scanner sees that as quote unquote that's a-okay, that is the quote unquote that's the normative frame, right? That's the thing it's been told to expect.
Yeah. So you're targeting the people who are non-conforming to whatever this data set is, right?
Precisely that. And that's the thing that in a number of ways, when this gets talked about, when defenses are made for it, that's the kind of answer that gets given, is people are saying, oh, well, we're just trying to find the kind of normal distribution of what people look like. And that quote unquote normal distribution of what people look like, that is very contextual. What is your your sample size? What is the distribution of that sample? What is what is the context in which you are sampling? How are you pulling all of these things together and making what you then average out to be your normal distribution? Because what that looks like and what you've taken into account, as you said at that at the outset, what you've tried to account for in the first place, is going to change what your actual end set looks like. And if that data set has that kind of that lacuna, that occultation of I didn't think to think about this. I didn't think to think about people who exist in the world in X, Y, and Z kinds of ways, then the data set will in fact be preemptively discriminatory against those people. And it will in fact punish people who are not conforming to what you probably unconsciously as a programmer decided was quote unquote normal. That's going to be a thing that again has wide ranging implications for a lot of people down the line. But if you're not thinking about it at the outset, if you're not conscious of, well, maybe I should be thinking about these other cases, or maybe I should be asking what I haven't thought about, then you're not going to have that moment of, taking a step back and trying to refigure what it is you've done. And in some cases, there's just no good way to kind of fix that, right? There's no good way to come in and retag that. And that's with things like facial recognition software and how they get used for police actions. I can't think of good ways that turns out to be, even if you were to say train facial recognition to do a better job of tagging people's faces, with darker skin tones, you're still dealing with the fact that facial recognition on overarching uses of pretty much all of it, that facial recognition is most often used against people in minority communities. They're used against Black and brown individuals at a higher rate in Western society because those communities have been preemptively deemed not by the technology itself, but by the people using that technology as criminal.
Yeah.
So, like, excuse me. These are all the things that kind of go into exactly what you were talking about there.
And I wonder, I've got like a devil's advocate question here for the face recognition stuff, because you alluded to just before we went on air that Amazon have got have made an announcement about this too. But if the distribution was, more sympathetic to a larger group of people, and maybe the environment of criminal activity wasn't so biased in the States as it has been historically, is face recognition still a good idea?
That's the fundamental kind of, for face recognition to be a good idea, like the antecedent conditions have to all be drastically different, right? Like it has to be the case that you're not in a scenario where minority communities are primarily targeted by police action at the outset, where they're primarily assumed to be criminal, where they are primarily assumed to be criminal because they are, by history, immigrant populations or enslaved populations that were targeted as criminal and, propagandized as as criminal from inclination from birth, right? Like this was the propaganda that got wheeled out in the States about why Black people needed to remain enslaved is because they couldn't be trusted on their own, or why Mexican immigrants needed to be, ostracized to the edges of society because they were, by definition, endemically lazy, endemically criminal. Why, Chinese populations couldn't be trusted because, they were inscrutable, and, this whole kind of, sneaky Asian stereotype that gets pushed into all of that, right? Like all of these things are so thoroughly woven into the kind of fundamental fabric of facial recognition, of policing in general, which uses facial recognition, that to make facial recognition a good idea is to say we have to go back in time and undo that like vast history of prejudice that kind of undergirds the policing in the context that uses it.
Yeah.
As it stands, another potential way that we could go forward with it would be to say we would have to, like, culture-wide interrogate all of those things, confront them like full on, and say, here's what's happening, here's what has happened for centuries. Now let's take a shot at undoing that, of repairing that damage, of setting to rights the vast systemic harms that have been caused by it. And then, once that project is complete, we can have that framework of going, okay, now what do we do? Literally, what are we doing when we program a facial recognition AI, an algorithm, to say, tag a person in a crowd for quote unquote suspicious behavior? Once that tag of suspicious behavior doesn't then carry the full weight of, well, we've already determined that certain people from certain parts of the world or with certain ethnicities are de facto suspicious, then at that point, once it doesn't have that woven into it anymore, then it can maybe be used in a way that isn't going to do vast like harms to justice. But it's a much bigger project than just, a lot of people do want to say that if we include more, diverse data sets, then we can get something like a fairer output. The output may be fairer, but at the end of the day, what's going to end up happening is you're going to get a facial recognition camera that sees my face better and can definitely distinguish me from a crowd better, but it's still going to be used on populations that look like me more often,
Yeah.
regardless of what those populations are actually up to in their daily
Yeah,
lives.
yeah. It's almost like you've got this really big lens and you're pointing it at the people who you expect to be,
Yep,
you know,
that's
yeah.
exactly it. So like this is like the kind of like lamp laws, like streetlight theory. It's like you're gonna find crime where you look
Yeah.
for it, and if you point at it and you only look for it in one space, and you're not finding, the crime you kind of consciously expect to find, you're gonna like engage as criminal behavior any behavior that you find there.
Yeah.
And so as that gets kind of reinforced and reinscribed over decades and centuries, then yeah, you get to this kind of perception where a certain population is always perceived as criminal, always perceived as a threat, always perceived as dangerous at the outset.
Yeah. And I feel like we've painted a really bleak picture there, but I guess
It is. I mean, there are some bleak elements. Definitely, there's some unfortunately like damaging and potentially really big downsides. But there are people who are working to kind of do AI work, who are working to do algorithmic work from a perspective that specifically interrogates all of the questions that we've been talking about, right? Like there are people who are trying to do work that says, okay, let's encode from the perspective of marginalized people at the outset. Let's like Contextual does work on decolonizing AI. And her work is just utterly fantastic. It's really interesting stuff on just like how do we take the kind of cultural perceptions of what AI is and kind of dig down on those, deconstruct those, and then say what are we doing as like a culture when we make these kinds of assumptions, and how do we make different kinds of assumptions. And there are people who are doing work on the implications of autism and not neurodivergent populations, and building from that perspective when building out automated systems and building out algorithmic implications or instantiations. So you've got people working, people like Oz Keys and their work on specifically interrogating fairness versus justice in the face of neurodivergent and disabled communities, right? And so we have people who are specifically trying to do this work and say it's not like the whole project of machine learning, the whole project of AI, the whole project of algorithmic systems is toast. It's not that. The answer is we have to do better. And in order to do better, we have to be honest about what we've done poorly so far. We have to be real about what's gone wrong. And then once we do that, we can kind of unpack it all and say, okay, what do we want to do different? How do we move forward in a different way, in a way that doesn't continue to do active real harm to the people that it has traditionally done active harm to? How do we do this in a way that allows us to like not just include people, but really truly represent them, to really include them in a way that is kind of systemic, foundational, and fundamental, and really genuinely honors who people are in the world and doesn't just try to like appropriate a perspective from over here and slap it into the coding of an algorithm and say, okay, well, we included that perspective and now we move on. But how do we like actually truly have something that is encoded from deeper principles that include and account for and seek to do real justice for people who have traditionally been harmed by this stuff?
So let's do that. I think from my perspective, this area has really blown up, right? So
Yeah.
I feel like maybe 5 years ago it was completely unknown, or like a burgeoning thing that automation was problematic, and we started seeing some things happening in industry that made it more obvious that that could be the case. And then a few years after that, we just had this. Well, actually, like from then on, we had questions. We just had lots of questions. How can this go wrong? Those like, how is this possible to go wrong? What kinds of things go wrong? That sort of thing. And then we had all these principles. We spent about 2 years across the whole world making principles, for better or worse, and I'd like to talk to you
Yep.
about that. And I feel like now, again, from my point of view, we're getting to the point where we're having to make this practical implementation side. Like, okay,
Mm.
well, maybe we should think about this. Like in this new implementation, we're going to apply some machine learning over here, and it's going to be for this thing, and these people are going to be impacted by this thing, hopefully in a positive way, because why are we going to be doing this
Right.
in the first place? But maybe we haven't thought about the
Right.
impact on these other group over here who are not, and all this sort of stuff. And I feel like that's happening now. Is that kind of the perspective that you kind of see?
Yeah, the yes, definitely the fact that like more and more people have really started to dig down on this idea of how exactly do we deal with, you know, all of the unintended consequences of the things that we thought we were doing right and that we realized we kind of hadn't accounted for, and then we had to rethink, and then we had to redo, and that kind of constant back and forth is definitely like been the scope over the past several years, where people have like built this greater awareness that isn't just within the community or just from people outside of the community looking in going, hey, what about this stuff over here? But like the community and researchers external to the community and the policy community, like politicians are starting to really get a sense of how all of this works and what needs to be accounted for, what needs to be thought about in the process of doing this work. And so I do definitely think that wider awareness is kind of the constant thing right now. And I'm glad of it. I'm very, very glad of it. But at the same time, one of the problems of that wider awareness is the kind of misperceptions that can come along with that, and the expectations that the fixes can be simple. So like you and I and the people that you've talked to on this podcast and the people that we work with and people who research this, people who've been in this community for, mumbledy numbers of years, we know that these things, even when we recognize the problem, that they require like real intense work. It's not just like, it's rarely just as simple as whoops, I forgot to code this thing over here. Let me go plug that in and everything will be fine.
Yep.
But when you start to bring in the perspectives of politicians who have no familiarity with this space, while I am very glad that more politicians are interested in what is happening in this space, because the implications of this work are definitely political implications, I am oftentimes dismayed at their level of unfamiliarity with what it actually takes to do this work well, because it means that they're asking the wrong questions. It means that when they go into a Senate hearing, or when they go into a parliamentary study, or when they go into commission a group of people to do this work, that the questions that they are asking them to answer at the outset don't fully encompass the nature of the problems that we're facing. Yeah. And so yeah, I am extraordinarily glad that more people are interested. I want for the wider population, what I've always wanted for those of us more directly connected to this work, is for us to interrogate our assumptions, ask what it is that we think we know, what it is we do not know, and to then move forward and say, okay, with what I don't know, who knows that? Who knows what I don't? What perspectives do I need to bring in that I can't account for? What kinds of questions should I be asking? And who's living those questions right now? Who doesn't have to ask those questions because they're living them immediately, right now, right? Like, when I looked at that headline from Amazon and I saw the new CEO going, we're gonna continue to work with law enforcement on facial recognition until we see that they're whether they're abusing it. Like, the answer is not whether they're abusing it. The answer is reach out to the communities who have been actively telling you for the past 10 years that they're definitely abusing it. Yeah. Like, it is happening, and people exist who can tell you exactly how, and to some great extent why it is happening. So heed them and like actually take those perspectives in so that you can kind of really dig down on what it is you don't know.
Yeah, I mean, for that, that sounds like the language of what I used to see a lot more of and it used to be part
Mm,
of my talks on kind of AI ethics and this area, where at the end of the talk, I'd be
mm,
like, it's not good enough, right? Just to go, this is someone else's problem, or like, I'm just making the thing. It's not really my responsibility to use the thing, right? Uh, you
right.
know, and
Yeah.
that's never been a good enough argument. And you can, this goes all the way
No.
back to the Manhattan Project and all these sorts of
Yep.
man-made big things that we've strived for and been able to achieve. And
Yeah.
you are responsible for your own actions. Like, there's very few instances you can get around that. And I think as an
Yeah.
organization, that's just vulgar. I would say.
Yes. Agreed. No, that's absolutely right. No, I 100% agree with that. And you're right that we did used to hear a lot more of the, oh, I'm just a programmer, I'm just a dev, I'm just a designer. It's not my job to think about how people are going to use it on the back end. But in that same way that you're talking about in the past 5 years or so, people have started to realize that that's never been a good answer. Like the implications to what we do matter, and we need to interrogate as many of those as we can before they come to pass. We need to show that we are at least willing to think about them. I think the last time we talked, one of the phrases I used was like the kind of the lag time, between asking the question and realizing that we needed to, do
Mm.
something, seeing the implications of that thing, and then turning around to fix it, right? Like there's that gap in reaction time between each of those stages. And one of the things that I'm still very concerned about is shortening the lag time between those things, right? Like it has to, like we can't be fully prescient about any of this stuff.
Mm.
Stuff happens that we can't foresee because we're doing so many things around the world as a species. So much is happening all the time that like they're gonna interact with each other in weird ways that we can't foresee, that we can't expect. That's fine, but we can reduce the amount of time it takes for us to adapt to what comes out the other side. And in order to do that, we have to be thinking about what might go wrong. What haven't I thought about, right? We have to be asking what I haven't considered. Because once that pops up,
Mm.
you're not going to have a whole heck of a lot of time to really think about it. So you have to already be in a mode of, something is going to be weird here. Something weird could always happen on the other side. And I have to be ready to think about that, to work with that, to adapt to that, and to possibly correct for it if it goes very wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we can never be prescient. We can't ever have perfect knowledge of exactly what the work we do will look like on the other end. And no, that doesn't mean we should just stop doing all work. It means we have to do what we can, as much as we can at the front end, and then be prepared to do more at any point after we put it out in the world.
Yeah. So on the cultural side, you do a
Mm.
lot of writing around this area of how we think about these sorts of technologies, robots and AI and consciousness, and how these things play out in the media and all these sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had like a headline kind of thing that you're looking at the moment in that space, because
Mm.
there's a lot that we could talk about there.
Yeah, there's always a little bit. There's always
Mm.
more. One of the things, like the major things that's kind of been really interesting to watch happen, is the GPT
Hmm.
three conversation, and talking about how do we think about the kinds of outputs that can be trained on these systems, and the larger ideas of language and natural language, and how do we think about AI and automated processes that kind of work with that language. One of the things that I think about in that space is, people get very worried at that kind of societal cultural level about like robots are going to steal our
Mm.
jobs, and the idea of like, well, what jobs are quote unquote worth having for humans? And this idea that there's always going to be some kind of automated system that kind of comes in from the background and snatches up what is supposed to be by rights a human field of endeavor, right? Like that's always been something that has animated our fears about AI, robotics, everything in that space. But one of the things that I've also seen as this has actually started to happen is that certain fields are still capable of being interrogated, still capable of being discerned as the work of an automated, robotic or otherwise programmed system. Right? We can see when something is too perfect in a particular way, machined too well on the kind of mechanical side of things, but also we can see when it's like trying to mimic something that it gets the actual formal structure of, but doesn't get the full context of. And so we can kind of still see that there are these places where human endeavor, the output of humans, is not really in any way endangered by this, and that we have this kind of sense of real understanding of something that makes a piece of writing or a piece of craft interesting to us. But that animation of this fear is always still there. That this thing is going to be able to write a paper or write an article or write a book better than a human. And like it's like I don't know that we're anywhere near there yet, because it's still always about what you train it on. Like, you want to write what kind of book? Would you be able to train GPT-3 to write a better Lovecraft book than H.P. Lovecraft ever wrote? Maybe. It would be a weird process. You want to give it all the Aldous Huxley writings that ever existed and have it write like Aldous Huxley. You might be able to do that. But is it going to be able to, at this stage of what it is, of functionally what it can do, be trained on the full breadth and depth of all of, literature, of all of prose that humans have written in any language, and then synthesize that into something that is interesting, that is functional, that is compelling? We're not there yet. We're still at a place where a text that does that, if you go in and you do, just a simple distribution of terms and associations, you're still in a place where it is associating words on a gender-biased, normative kind of scale. It still has that basic level of like word to vec associations going on in the background that we've already seen very easily get gender and race encoded into them in a fundamental way. It still hasn't solved for that. So if it still can't solve for that, if it can't self-interrogate to ask that question of what, if it's doing that, I mean, obviously a lot of humans still can't self-interrogate to see whether they're doing that, but like, I still can't, as it exists, put it to the system to say, hey, you're doing some weird misogyny stuff over here. Maybe don't do that. Maybe don't associate those terms in that way all the time. Maybe don't think of the idea of what philosophy is conceptually as this kind of nonsense practice. Because that's another thing that has happened, is that like when it's told to write about certain things, it writes in a way that is pejorative to some disciplines, because the things that it has been trained on is pejorative to those disciplines. So it's like it still fully can't be made to interrogate itself on those levels yet. So that kind of cultural animation of like, I'm afraid that we're going to lose our jobs to these things. Like, you might lose some kinds of jobs, but those jobs are all going to be real rote, and anybody could have always done those jobs. And those are not the jobs, like those are middle management jobs. Like those are the jobs that like, you've got somebody who's worried about that kind of being a junior executive kind of job, right? Like that's fine, but it's not necessarily the kind of thing that, we're deeply concerned about. My overarching thing has always been really like, at a certain level of automation, we should be able to just kind of like let certain things be done in the background by any system that can and wants to do them, and then free up people to do the things that people actually can and want to do more broadly, right? Like, we have things that are just interesting to us as a species. I don't mean like things that apply to all of us as a species. I mean things that like we think are cool, that we want to be able to do. And as a species, we should be able to do those things. And we're tied to these ideas of the value of jobs, the worth of jobs. Work is interesting and important and keeps our, lives meaningful, right? Like being able to do stuff. But that stuff doesn't need to necessarily be a job. It doesn't necessarily need to be the thing that we literally depend on to live. It currently is for all of us. But there's still so much that happens in the space of automation, of what we fear AI might do. And we're still not talking about what it maybe could do, what we hope it might help us do. Why not take that space of AI is here to augment our lives, right? AI can help us think through tasks and help us complete things, and then expand on that. And the answer is currently because most of the AI applications are controlled by people who want money. They want money and they want power. And so they're keeping those systems functional in those ways with those tools. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, right? Like, and this kind of gets to that kind of broader question of if we did ever come back to that dream of an autonomous generated intelligence, a real conscious machine. If we came back around to that, what would we want it to be like? What would we want it to think like? What are the founding principles we would want it to have been built on? Because if we build it on the founding principles of Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, Facebook, Google, those are principles that are going to, very possibly paperclip maximize, right? They're going to try to build profit at any cost because that's what those founding principles are. But if they're built on those marginalized perspectives that we were talking about otherwise, right? If we think instead not about that fear, but about that possibility, not about that kind of diversity inclusion pastiche, but that real marginalized representation, and we build an AGI from that perspective, we say what lived experiences need consideration, need justice, need representation, need understanding in a way that hasn't been possible before now. That foundation, that scaffolding for a potentially conscious mind is a drastically different thing than something that's built on the idea of maximize profit at all costs. And while, again, I still think we're not quite there yet, we're not at the AGI place yet, and a lot of people, like I said, have unfortunately abandoned that goal. I guess the landscape of the process is still such that whatever does get built, if we come back to that dream, is going to be built off of the work that we are doing now. The kinds of processes that we're thinking about now. And so I would very much like for us to think about what values we as a culture are encoding into the automated applications that we are doing right now, what it is we are afraid of, and what it is we can hope for in that space.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a way because there's a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah.
I like I've got this vision in my mind that we're all doing things now which are positive direction, more inclusive and more thoughtful, respecting human, dignity and all that sort of stuff when we're creating these things, and that actually it would be like hard to think about making a system which wasn't like that, like in the future. If that would be nice, right? Like, oh yeah, we made it like that because that's how we make stuff, right? Like we don't
Exactly.
make stuff to optimize like this one metric, which is cash, right? Like that would be silly. Why would we be doing that?
Why would we do that?
Cool.
Yeah, it would be nice to get to that place where that is the kind of forerunner. And I do think that more people are, like I said, I think that more people are actually starting to think in terms of that kind of wider and deeper kind of values level than just maximize efficiency, maximize output of cash, right? But I still think that so many of the, excuse me, I think so many of the corporations that do fund this work, so many of the groups that are at the back end that commission the designs of these tools are still putting them to the purpose of maximization of cash and efficiency. And I think that that's a problem, because one of the things that I've kind of struggled with, and one of the things that I really kind of like try to hammer home, is the way that we then implement these tools, if they can learn from themselves, from their environment, from the world, if they are in fact self-adapting, if they're capable of, improving themselves as they function based on what they take in, what they can discern, what they can then eliminate, if they can move through this kind of discriminative process, then they're going to learn not just from what they're encoded with. They're going to learn not just from their initial data set, but they're going to also learn from how they're implemented, how they're put out into the world, how they're made to function once they are in the world. And once they are in the world and they are functioning in particular ways, this comes back to that kind of that facial recognition thing, right? If I point that facial recognition software at particular communities and tell that facial recognition program, hey, these particular communities tend to be more criminal than if the facial recognition software is truly autonomous, if it gets to a place of truly being able to learn the assumptions that are encoded into it are going to meet up with the implications of its implementation, how it has been told to function, where it has been told to operate, what kind of things it will tag as suspicious, to gets to the point where any black or brown body, regardless of what it's actually doing, is automatically tagged as potential criminal. And that kind of foundational problem, like that baseline issue, is still the, if we come back to that place, if we're going to make a mind, we're going to make an intelligent machine, a conscious machine, or even if we accident into it, even if we we don't intentionally do it, but we create something that is complex enough and capable of self-reflection enough and capable of self-determination enough that it has to be considered conscious, then ultimately what it has been trained on, what it has been predisposed toward, what it has been given to think like and to think about, to work with, is going to form the basis of how it understands the world. And we got to be really careful about what it is we have given it as tools with which to understand the world.
That's a really good point. There's a episode I did with a wonderful lady, which I can't remember her name either because I am terrible with names. Here we go. Julia Musbridge, who
I love Julia. Julia is fantastic.
Julia is great.
Julia and I know each other very well. We work together on a number of things.
And she just talking about this idea that there's this kind of mothership kind of thing, like not a spaceship, like a you're mothering, you're teaching, and and it's like you said, like you can kind of teach it in a way that you're like directly giving it the capabilities, right, which is a technical thing. But then you're showing it the world and saying, like, let's go, let's do stuff, let's do the useful stuff, let's not like explode the world or whatever.
Right. No, and it's like, exactly that. It's the difference between giving it the capabilities at the front end versus showing it how to then use those capabilities, how to, actually engage the world with its talents. And that's different. Those things are both very drastically important, because if you give me the innate skills to understand math and, math, chemistry, and physics, and I then decide I want to put those towards weapons making, that's very different than I decide I want to put those towards free energy and, the most efficient solar panel that I can create, right? Like, those are very different implementations of the same basic skill sets. So I have to be shown an example that I want to follow, that I'm given to understand is good. And the implementation of those things, the society in which I'm steeped, the culture in which I'm steeped, is in many ways that example. Now, we can push against the culture that we're born into, obviously, but the more we're steeped in it without ever given cause to interrogate it, without ever giving cause to question how we're raised, the harder it is for us to push back against it. And we see the implications of that in humans all the time, right? Like, the older people get without ever having had their worldview questioned, the harder it is for them to break out of that worldview if they are pushed against something that says, maybe don't work that way. Maybe don't hold the ideas that says that women are less than, or people of certain genders are less than, that people of certain ethnicities are less than. Maybe don't react that way. Maybe that's a bad way to be in the world. The older someone gets, the more steeped in their environment they get, the more on all sides, even at a young age, that is simply their world. When some countervailing evidence comes along, the harder it is to say, include that evidence, to consider that evidence. And in fact, studies have shown that what happens is that people actually just kind of close themselves off to any countervailing evidence the longer it goes on. They say, no, that can't be real. They ignore the reality of it. And we've seen very recently in the United States what that looks like when that happens at a wide scale. When countervailing evidence that says your position has no tenability, no basis. It is just a string of cards that were holding each other up by their own weight. There's no underneath here. It's a system that hangs itself on itself. Here's some countervailing evidence that kind of maybe can help you reframe that. Their response is no. And not only are you a liar, but you're a conspirator in this vast conspiracy against me and mine. And then, once they've done that, once you're in that space, the possibility of getting them out of it is always, it's ever harder. It's not impossible, but it's ever harder. Because any evidence against the conspiracy is immediately subsumed by the conspiracy. I don't know about you, but I don't want an AI that thinks like that.
Nice.
I don't want a conscious machine that refuses to consider countervailing evidence and reads any and all evidence against its position, against its understanding that paperclip maximization is the best thing for humans, bar none, and says any evidence against my position is automatically wrong. It's part of the conspiracy against me, and I will paperclip maximize harder. That's not how I want it to live, but currently the culture in which it will be implemented is a culture that is very easily tended toward that direction.
Yep. So, Damien, thank you very much for your time. We're getting towards the end now, because I can hear little feet and things in the background. So that's the kind of my alarm bell.
Yes. Yes.
If you could succinctly, as possible, we have the last question on the podcast is, what scares you about this technology and what excites you about it in this automated future that we have?
Okay. What scares me about this is, all of the potential downsides that we've talked about so far. The exacerbation of bias, the exacerbation of injustice, the continual uninterrogated assumptions about what the quote-unquote right way for a person to live is that's being given to all of these systems. And then those systems then both iterate on all of those assumptions and expand them out and make them something that we never really anticipated, right? That scares me. And it's happening now, and it's only likely to get worse if we don't really dig down and try to fix it, and understand what it is we need to fix. What excites me about it, what gives me hope, is the fact that there are people who recognize this and who want to do that work of digging down on this. The fact that there are people in high levels of the United States government as of this year who understand these things, fundamentally recognize the implications on society of technology writ large. Now, that's something that we haven't ever really had before. In the Office of Science and Technology, that was always something that was focused towards STEM. It never really included, social sciences. It never really took the perspective of, okay, what are the, how do we talk about sociology in this framework? But we have that now. We have people who think about how human life, human values, human society impacts the technology that we make, and vice versa. And that gives me great hope. And I'm hopeful that we will be able to kind of take that beginning crack and widen it and build on it and build something that allows us to kind of really open up this conversation and do work differently in this space.
Wicked. Thank you very much for your time again. It's been a joy to speak to you, as always. And if people want to find out more about your work, follow you, contact you, how do they do that?
Best way to find me online is either on Twitter. I'm on Twitter as Wolven. That's WOLVEN. I'm also at my website, afutureworththinkingabout.com. And from there, either of those places, you can find contact me links, you can find my newsletter, all kinds of stuff that hopefully you'll take some time to read.
Wicked. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Ben.
Hello, and welcome to the end of the podcast. Thanks again to Damien. Really lovely talking again. If you want to check out our first chat, please go to episode 24, which was the AI retreat back in 2018, I think. Also, we mentioned Julia Mossbridge. You can check out her interview on episode 30. We're looking at more stats at the moment, so as the podcast is completely self-hosted, I'm having to do all that sort of stuff. And all the different stats are very convoluted and different from different platforms. I'm trying to get a handle on all the things and do some programming myself on the server side to work out what's going on. On the basic level, we know that we get around about 1,000 subscribers, or we have around 1,000 subscribers, which is great. So hello to you. If you'd like to support us some more, go to patreon.com/machine ethics. And thanks again for listening, and obviously like, subscribe, all that sort of jazz. Thanks again, and I'll speak to you soon.